Join me for a special anniversary occasion on which, alongside the new releases, I'll be delving into the vaults to bring you some of the highlights of 21 years of the BBC-1 film programme. Coincidentally, I've written a book listing my choice of the 100 best films of the century, and you can win a copy of that, plus, much more desirable this, one of our hugely coveted Film 92 sweatshirts in our competition. So do join me in a star-studded cast for the Film 92 anniversary special. That's Monday night, 10:10 on BBC-1.
A dramatic medical case of law and order in an hour on BBC-1 when doctors at a hospital close ranks to protect one of their number, a top surgeon accused of murder. Now Peter Sissons introduces his guests in Question Time.
Good evening and welcome to Question Time, which tonight is in Blackpool, scene this week of the Labour Party conference, the first since their fourth consecutive election defeat, and their big changes at the top. Around the table, one of the biggest changes, the new deputy leader and campaigns coordinator, Margaret Beckett, who until this summer was Labour's pillar of financial rectitude as shadow chief secretary to the Treasury. Indeed, so stern was her grip on the shadow purse strings that some called her the other Margaret. Like you-know-who, Margaret Beckett believes she's better than John Major. I know, she said recently, because I was his opposite number. Not recorded are her views about the others she's shadowed, David Mellor and Michael Portillo, for whom the Lion's Den tonight rates as light relief after the last 2 weeks at the Treasury. Mr. Portillo is, of course, the current chief secretary thereof, a promotion that catapulted him into the cabinet at the age of 38 and now gives him unique influence over the toughest spending ground for years. At the age of 8, he was the fresh-faced child in a TV commercial for a blackcurrant drink with the thought, each day a little older, a little wiser, a little stronger. Trebles of Ribena all round at number 11. Malcolm Bruce is the trade, industry and employment spokesman for the Liberal Democrats. Although born on Merseyside, he was, until earlier this year, the first elected leader of the Lib Dems in Scotland. At this year's party conference, he labelled the Labour Party the most conservative party in British politics. And to cynical voters who say to him, you politicians are just out for yourselves, he has a stock answer, if that were so, I would be in the Tory party. Arthur Scargill is the national president of the National Union of Mine Workers, reduced to 40,000 members now against 200,000 in 1985. Described as Britain's best-known unreconstructed class warrior, he said recently, I am the trade union leader that doesn't sell out. 2 weeks ago, he leaked a secret memo from the DTI to Michael Portillo, suggesting that British coal may this year close another 30 pits, reducing the industry to just 20 by privatisation in 1994. Today, the Labour conference gave Arthur Scargill a standing ovation when he asked them who was telling lies about pit closures in 1984. Let's have the first question, which comes from Mr. Joe Harty, who is a retired headmaster. Mr. Harty.
Is the latest attempt by Herr Schlesinger of the German Bundesbank to undermine the British government the final nail in the coffin of our ERM membership? And is that prospect to be welcomed?
I think you're referring to the leaked letter from the President of the Bundesbank, which appears further to have angered the British government with its defence of recent German actions and implicit criticism of British handling of the sterling crisis. Michael Portillo.
Well, I don't think the letter itself will make much difference to that. I think it will be some considerable time before we can think of going back into the ERM. Clearly, the conditions recently have been extremely difficult. Lots of currencies have found that, the lira, the franc, the pound, the Irish punt, and so on. It's been a period of tremendous turbulence. We've got this underlying problem that the Germans are running very high interest rates because at the moment they have the problem of reunification. Here in Britain, we're in recession, and recently our interest rates have been higher in the ERM than we would have needed to control our inflation at home. Now, with the turbulence and with the continuing German condition contrasted with the British position, it is pretty difficult to go back into the ERM. And I believe that we can continue to control inflation outside the ERM, and I think we can run, as we are doing, a very sensible economic policy outside the ERM. But we did pursue that policy for 2 years. It did get inflation down. It did enable us to get interest rates down. We don't want to cast all of that away, and we don't want to say that ERM brought us disbenefits, because it did not. So going back one day must be a possibility, but realistically, I have to say that it's some time away. But Mr. Schlesinger's letter really, I don't think, makes any difference to the position one way or the other.
What's the point of bringing back the Maastricht Bill before the House of Commons, as Mr. Major now says he may do before Christmas, if we're not in the ERM and have no prospect of an early return?
Because, Peter, there's no connection between the two.
Oh,
no, there isn't, because a country like Greece, for example, is not a member.
Mechanism is the first step on the road to monetary union, which is what Maastricht is all about.
Well, it's what Maastricht is about for the others, but remember that the British signed a special Maastricht deal. And our special Maastricht deal did not commit us to monetary union, did not commit us to a single currency, and didn't commit us to the social contract. But even if we were one of those so committed, there isn't the connection between ERM and Maastricht that people think. The Greek government, for example, is not a member of ERM, and yet is a signatory to Maastricht. And of course, the Italians have left ERM, but they're going ahead with Maastricht. So there is not that connection. But you say, why did the Prime Minister say he was going ahead? Because he negotiated a very good deal. He didn't sign those two pieces of paper concerning the social contract and concerning monetary union, which the others did sign, which, by the way, have been a large part of the problem in the Danish and the French referendums. He didn't sign those bits of paper. He came back to the House of Commons at Christmas time and was received with acclaim. He took the second reading of the bill through the House of Commons and it passed with a majority. His government has a programme, and Maastricht is part of it. And he is saying, if the Danes resolve their problem, and it looks as if they are set to do that, then I'm going to get on with my programme. He's leading from the front, and that is something that the Conservative Party will respond to.
Margaret Beckett.
I think what Michael could have said more shortly is that the Prime Minister feels that what's left of his credibility is at stake. But to return to the question that we were asked about the letter, the most interesting thing, I think, about the letter is the question, is it true? Because what the contents of the letter suggest, and it was, of course, as you say, leaked, is that it's not the case, as the government told the House of Commons a week ago, that they were overtaken by unforeseen events and none of this could have been helped and they were swept away. It suggests that, in fact, they mismanaged affairs, which I must say I wouldn't find surprising, and that, in fact, it is a large part their incompetence for which we're likely to pay such a heavy price. And we have sought and will continue to seek a point-by-point rebuttal from the government of the letter, if, as they imply, but don't actually seem to claim, it is in some way inaccurate. You also asked about, is it to be welcomed? In the long term, we do believe that Britain does need to be in a managed system of exchange rates. It's temporarily allowed us to reduce interest rates. In the longer term, if we have a floating pound, it could force us to put them up again. And in the long term, there's always a price to be paid for a fully floating exchange rate, and certainly our industry very much would wish in the longer term to have the stability of some sort of managed system, the ERM if it survives, presumably, or if not, something in its place.
Those sentiments could have been expressed exactly by anybody on the Conservative side.
I didn't hear him expressing them, did you?
Well, the bit about needing the ERM in the long term, would you agree with that?
Well, it is certainly the case, you see, that we were following a joint policy, which is why it is so surprising.
I mean, a bipartisan policy.
Well, more than that, actually. Labour, Liberal, TUC, CBI all thought ERM was a good idea. Everybody committed to that policy. But some people apparently not accepting the responsibilities that went with it. I mean, we've heard a lot of drivel about all the money that has been spent on propping up the pound. But that was an absolute obligation under the rules of the ERM that you had to buy pounds when the pound hit the floor. And it wasn't just we who were buying pounds. The Bundesbank spent billions of Deutschmarks on buying pounds.
What the letter suggests is that you let the pound hit the floor. That's what the letter suggests, that you abandon the pound, you let the pound hit the floor, and you therefore cause a large part of your own problems. But let me just come back to the point you made about the ERM,
was
Michael.
the moment that Dr. Schlesinger's comments hit the markets.
The comments you made earlier on about the ERM, we've always argued that ERM membership or something like it was necessary. But what we've also argued is that it was by no means sufficient. Standing on its own, our membership of the ERM merely left the weakness of our economy exposed. You should have been backing up ERM membership with policies to promote investment and training and active pursuit of a strong economy. You didn't do that, our economy was weak, and ultimately the pound was bound to come under attack, as it did.
Arthur Scargill.
I think this letter demonstrates that the Germans are defending their own position, and that's perfectly understandable. But it also reveals one other thing, and that is that someone's telling lies. And on the basis of recent past history, I put my money on the fact that this Tory government are telling lies. I'm absolutely convinced that both the Tory government, the Labour Party, and the Liberal Democrats are wrong. We shouldn't be in the ERM, we shouldn't adhere or sign the Maastricht Agreement, and the sooner we make that publicly clear, the better. And the only way we can determine this policy is to offer the same facility to our people that the Danes, the Irish and the French have offered to theirs. Let the people of this country decide whether they want unelected, unaccountable people, faceless people in Brussels to determine our future, and whether or not it's justified to throw away between 12 and 15 billion pounds of taxpayers' money trying to prop up an unsustainable pound. I think the answer would be an overwhelming no to Maastricht and an overwhelming no to the ERM.
Very briefly, do you think Labour are missing a trick, not trying to force a referendum through the House of Commons with Tory rebel support?
I think they're missing a splendid opportunity not only to defeat the Tory government on the question of the ERM and Maastricht, but to bring the Tory government down and have another general election. And I happen to be convinced that if we'd have had someone like Harold Wilson in power, he would have seen the sense of going for the jugular, and he would have determined that the British people ought to have had the right to determine this issue themselves. Why is it that the Irish have got the right, the French have got the right, and the Danes, but both the Tories, the Liberals and the Labour Party, for some reason, suggest that you're not capable of making up your own minds? I happen to believe that you've got the right to democratically record your vote for or against the Maastricht Agreement. And I happen to think it's a no.
Malcolm Bruce.
I think Arthur's forgotten that Harold Wilson, when he did decide to have a referendum, also suggested we should stay in Europe and move towards closer integration rather than the other way around. But that's just a detail of history, I suppose. I think the particular first question really should be laid. The fact is the Chancellor of the Exchequer tried in his hour of most desperate beleaguerment to blame the Bundesbank for the total economic mess that his policy had got us into. And it's not going into the ERM that was the mistake. It was going into the ERM the day before a party conference for purely political reasons at a rate that was not the most advantageous rate, and without even negotiating entry with the colleagues within the ERM who are actually going to be responsible for bailing us out when we got into difficulty. Secondly, failing to pursue a policy that would create a British economy that was going to enable it to sustain that exchange rate. And thirdly, not setting up an independent bank whose judgment and actions might have been trusted by the market far more than a politically motivated Chancellor of the Exchequer who announces on the day of panic that he's going to put up interest rates, but immediately says it's only a temporary measure, which completely defeats the whole objective of showing that he's made of stern stuff and is prepared to stand his ground. So in all those circumstances, the government, I think, are in every way responsible for the mess that we're in. And to take the question as final point, Arthur says we should vote against Maastricht and we should get out of the ERM. He doesn't tell us where we should go. He doesn't tell us what kind of a future it will be. He doesn't tell us how we can sustain any exchange rate for the pound, how we can control inflation. Incidentally, nor does Michael Portillo tell us how we're now going to control inflation. And in those circumstances, we clearly have got to ensure that we're part of the policy-making process of Europe because we'll be affected by it whether we're there or not. We can either bob around like a cork in their wake, or we can be in the centre of power making decisions. We've got to get back in the ERM. I would suggest when German interest rates harmonise with ours is the time to do it.
I'll come back to the panel in a moment. Mr. Harty, you have your say.
Well, I feel that the membership of the ERM limited the freedom of action of the government, for example, in the area of interest rates, which was greatly to our disadvantage. Therefore, I feel that coming out gives us an opportunity to address the problems of our economy rather than following a policy which was designed to address the problems of the German economy.
Thank you. Gentleman at the front here.
Yes, it's hard to see a chink of daylight between the Labour and the Tory policy on the ERM and Maastricht. It's been clear for quite some time that they agreed on the principle, the Labour Party have agreed on the principle of the ERM, and not only that, but also on the central rate of 2.95. But I'd like to say this to Margaret Beckett. It's also obvious to the casual observer that had we had the misfortune to have a Labour victory in April, the events of 2 weeks ago would have happened just the same, but they would have happened on the day following a Labour government being formed. But I also want to say, well, I'll have the opportunity to Mr Portillo, that it was clear 12 months ago that membership of the ERM was rendering the British economy a basket case. And why do we have to wait for the men in red braces to eject us and offer us the lifeline of a floating pound? Why couldn't the government have done it for us?
Well, let's just take that point very briefly, if you could. Why, for a start, did we miss an opportunity to realign, as the Germans are suggesting?
No, there was no offer of an opportunity to realign made to us by the Germans in the way that has been suggested. But why did we go through with the whole thing? Because I believe the fundamental problem with the British economy has been inflation, the fact that we are not competitive. Our wages and our prices rise faster than other countries. That makes us uncompetitive. We can't then sell things, and that gives us unemployment. Now, what the ERM did was very rapidly indeed to reduce inflation.
But that gave us unemployment as well.
Yes, and that is absolutely the consequence of having inflation, that unemployment will follow. And it is equally true that if you get rid of inflation, then fuller employment will follow that. And that is the process that we're going through.
Devaluation, get rid of inflation.
We've never managed to retain low inflation and low unemployment at the same time in the last 45 years.
We have had periods in which we've had low inflation, which have been followed by the big creation of jobs. That happened in the early 1980s. And by the way, even today, we've got 2 million more jobs than we had in 1983 because we had so many jobs created during the 1980s.
Let me hear from that lady there.
Mr Portillo, I've been waiting for the last 13 years for the Conservative Party to prove to me that things in Britain are going to get better. We've listened to Mrs Thatcher and the rest of the Tory party's economic policy. When is it going to get better?
For the vast majority of the British people, things have got better and are better. You can see that in people's living standards all around you. What we have now is a problem of unemployment and high interest rates. We hope that we can keep interest rates. They're now 6% below where they were. Let's hope that we can keep them there. That will help to rebuild confidence. That will help to rebuild jobs. But what we must not do at any time is give up the fight against inflation, because high inflation will just lead to uncompetitiveness,
but you don't have a policy,
and that will lead to the loss of jobs. Malcolm, we do have a policy for inflation.
You hope.
We will maintain our interest rates at the level which is necessary for domestic conditions to continue the fight against inflation. That is the policy that we followed in the early 1980s, actually with great success. It's a disappointment that we're out of the ERM, but we make the most of this opportunity, which is indeed, as has been said, that we can now set interest rates purely on domestic conditions.
There's lots of hands up in the audience. I want to hear from you. No speeches, but lots of good points, please. Lady there. Yeah.
Yes. In 1939, our Prime Minister brought back a piece of paper like you said Mr Major did. And he said everything was going to be fine. It wasn't fine, but it cured the unemployment situation.
Right at the back. Lady, yes.
Why didn't the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats vote against us going into the RM until it was a suitable rate for them?
No, but let's just take a few more points.
There was no vote, can I just point out. The government did it the day before the Conservative Party conference. They didn't tell the House of Commons, they told the press.
Well, they were entitled to do that, weren't
yeah, but there was no vote.
There was no vote.
And that gentleman there.
There are complaints about numeracy and illiteracy, and Mr Portillo's just said we've got 2 million more jobs. But we've now got 5 million out of work. You know.
That's because more and more people are working. We have 70% of our population in work. We have more women working than ever before. Of course you can have more jobs and more unemployment. The two are not incompatible.
How many young people haven't worked for 3, 4, 5 years?
I don't know, but we are very keen indeed to provide opportunities for those young people. And I can tell you that 3/4 of our young people are either still at school today or are in training, and those are opportunities they didn't have a few years ago.
Why
Gentleman there.
apprentice
No,
training
that gentleman
by
there.
10% each year on average? There's far less people. There's a complaint last week that no graduates are taking up engineering. Why is that? It's like an advertisement. For the last 13 years, every time you turn the television on, you hear engineering's closed down. So why are people not going into engineering?
But one of the very best things that has happened is that we have moved the number of people in higher education, in universities and polytechnics, from 1 in 8 to 1 in 4, heading towards 1 in 3. That is a tremendous new opportunity for young people. That's been one of our very significant achievements.
Can we just get back onto the subject in hand? I'll try and take one or two more. Gentleman there.
Arthur Scargill said earlier that he was unclear why the major political parties wouldn't allow a referendum. I think he knows the answer very much as I do it, and the answer is that the probable answer would be no.
Lady in front row here.
Oh, that's what we thought last time.
Why didn't the opposition parties, in fact, give the British people a chance to vote on this by having different policies at the general election instead of all saying the same thing?
Margaret Beckett.
I'm not in politics to say something that just happens to be different from the Conservative Party or the Liberal Party. I'm in politics to try to work out what is right and best for Britain and to advocate that to the British people and hope that they'll accept it. And frankly, this decision about whether or not... I'm sorry, I totally disagree with the gentleman at the back. I think it was very clear from what Arthur said at the end that, like so many people who argue that we should have another referendum, he believes that we should have it because he believes the answer will be no. I think that he's mistaken, and one of the reasons he's mistaken is because a lot of us who argued for the first referendum, and indeed argued for a rebuttal, thought then that the answer would be no. That's when we took the decision that put us on this road. We've had our referendum in this country, and at the time, many of us were arguing that this is exactly where it would lead us. But that was 20 years ago. Now we have to look to where Britain's interests are best served tomorrow, and next year, and in the next millennium. And that has to be in Europe.
Let me just put a final question on your behalf to Michael Portillo. The Financial Times writes today that Mr. Lamont is simply not the man to articulate a new economic policy with conviction. Why should the country trust him? This is a newspaper read all around the world by people of influence. It is seen as the voice of British finance and commerce. Shouldn't he go?
It's the newspaper, I think, that made a fool of itself by calling for a Labour victory in the general election. It is not the newspaper, I think, that you purport it to be. Norman Lamont went to the House of Commons last week and scored a triumph in what anybody would admit was a supremely difficult position. He wiped the floor with Gordon Brown and had the full support of his party.
Ridiculous.
And had the full support of his party. And the way our parliamentary democracy works is that our ministers must enjoy the confidence of the House of Commons. And Norman Lamont does. Let me just say, one of the reasons Arthur Scargill, I suspect, wants a referendum is that he doesn't anyway believe in parliamentary democracy because he is a Marxist. And we are going to take these decisions in Parliament, and we have a parliamentary democracy. And the answer both to Maastricht, why are we doing that in Parliament, and to the question about Norman Lamont, why does he continue as Chancellor, is that it is our parliamentary democracy that decides big issues like Maastricht and decides whether ministers have the confidence or not.
Yes, I am. I'm a Marxist. The trouble is, Michael Portillo's a Marx and Spencerist, and that's what's getting us into this difficulty. You see, very briefly. Malcolm Bruce said, have I got an alternative? Of course we've got an alternative. My alternative is a simple one. Stop spending £8,000 per year per person to keep a man or woman unemployed. Put people back to work, build schools, hospitals, houses, develop the whole programme. That's the way to put Britain back. And the way to judge it is to say to the British people in a referendum, you have the right to decide. Other countries have also got parliamentary democracies. What makes us so special that the parliamentarians think they've got a God-given right to decide and you haven't? We should have a referendum.
Can you be really quick?
For years and years, no one was allowed to vote for you at all. It was only when we gave people the right to vote that you became an elected person.
It demonstrates how silly you are. Yeah. No, if you're going to make statements, get them right. Arthur Scargill stood for election 5 times and was elected on a majority vote. Your government's in power on a minority vote. Start talking sense.
Then we're moving on.
The Daily Telegraph also said during this week that Norman Lamont couldn't command the confidence of the markets anymore. I don't remember it telling anybody to vote Labour.
You can't very well replace Norman Lamont until you have a policy that any other chancellor can perpetrate. You don't know what you're going to do yet. Till you do, I suspect you're stuck with Norman Lamont.
Thank you very much.
I've explained the policy.
We're going to move on. We're going to take another question. This is from Ernest Purdy, who is retired. Mr. Purdy.
Yes, sir. Can the panel explain how closing down coal mines with the consequential unemployment and resultant imports of coal will help the British economy?
Margaret Beckett.
It certainly won't help the British economy. In fact, it's madness. We produce our coal, I don't want to steal Arthur's lines, but we produce our deep mine coal cheaper, for example, than do the Germans. Right across the European community, other countries are anxious to develop reserves and think it's madness for this country to run the risk of losing valuable energy resource. And of course, the policy makes even less sense today than it did 2 weeks ago, because it is based on subsidized imports from elsewhere in the world. And even those subsidized imports will now cost a lot more as a result of the issue we've just been discussing, the devaluation of the pound. So it doesn't make any sense, and it's hard to see why the government is pursuing it.
Malcolm Bruce.
Well, it doesn't make sense, but then it doesn't make sense that we don't have an energy strategy in this country in spite of our own very substantial reserves. We have oil, we have coal, we have gas, and yet we have no coordinated strategy as to how we should be using this. It's worth remembering, too, that billions of pounds of your money were spent on developing extremely expensive nuclear power stations, which are now being used, of course, to destroy coal's ability to compete. Coal has got certain problems, nobody would deny that, of which environmental ones are ones that could cause concern. But again, if coal had been given the benefit of the kind of investment that's gone into nuclear power, we might have developed much more sophisticated clean coal technology by now. One of the things that concerns me too is that when British coal closes pits, it substantially destroys the reserves in those pits. And I think this is a piece of vandalism that no corporation should be allowed to get away with. The industry is in fact profitable at the moment. It's become profitable by closing down a lot of pits, which are, Arthur will tell you this, uneconomic in short-term terms, but not by any means exhausted. If you try to shut down an oil field or a gas field, you have to get the government's consent to do so, and it's not easily given. But British Coal owns all our coal reserves and can close any pit it likes any time it wants, and very rarely after a pit is closed is it reopened. The only positive thing I can say is that we do have one pit in Scotland that has reopened in the last few weeks, where the miners themselves have acquired the licence. They've taken a very big risk, and I don't know whether they will succeed, and they had to fight tooth and nail, I have to say, against both Conservative and Labour politicians to get the right to get the licence for that pit. I hope they're successful, and I certainly do believe that we need an energy strategy that ensures that we use coal, but frankly, that is not necessarily confined simply to British Coal being the only operator and certainly the only owner of coal reserves in Britain.
Michael Portillo.
Well, hundreds of thousands of jobs have gone in the coal industry since the First World War onwards. Hundreds of thousands of jobs in coal have been lost under Labour governments and Conservative governments alike. It's a long-term reduction. I very much hope that the level of the industry will soon stabilise. We want to put it into the private sector.
At what?
I don't know, and I'm going to come to that point. The level at which it stabilises is the level at which there is demand for the coal. The electricity industry has been buying 70 million tonnes a year. It's now thinking it only needs to buy 40 million, maybe 30 million tonnes a year. And here you come to a crucial issue of competitiveness. British industry depends on the electricity produced in our power stations. The cost of that electricity depends upon the fuel that you put into the power stations. British coal is quite an expensive product compared with nuclear power or gas or some imported coals. Now, the electricity industry is going to maintain contracts for 30 million tonnes, for 40 million tonnes, I don't know exactly, and the number of employees in the industry will come from that. But let no one be deceived. The government has put in money from the taxpayer of about 13 billion over the last few years. Electricity prices have been higher in this country than they needed to be because we've been buying British coal. We have to let competitiveness work its way through.
But will you
if we're not going to disadvantage British industry.
Will you resist that worst case outlined in the Tim Sainsbury memo, the reduction of the industry to 20 pits?
I don't know what it's going to end up at, and it's not going to be a government policy or a government decision. It's going to depend on what coal can be sold to the electricity industry. That is going to be the determinant. And they're negotiating at the moment, by the way, with the government helping to ensure that the coal industry is given the fairest possible deal in those negotiations. But the amount of coal that can be sold is going to be the key determinant. And one of the reasons, by the way, that it means fewer miners, of course, is that since the miners' strike and since the very restrictive hand of Arthur Scargill was removed from much of the coal industry, productivity has doubled. So, of course, each man is now producing twice as much coal as he was 6 or 7 years ago.
Arthur Scargill.
Well, he ought to have first prize for the goal that is just displayed to this audience. The fact is that British coal are producing higher output levels as a result of the 1974 Plan for Coal devised by the Labour government and the investment policy that worked through in that interim period. Secondly, Michael Portillo talks about being competitive, and he knows full well that British coal is 350% cheaper than nuclear power. He also knows that the British taxpayers are giving each year £1.3 billion by way of a subsidy to the nuclear power industry. That's the equivalent of £50 per tonne for every tonne of British coal produced. In actual fact, if we got that subsidy, we could give our coal away free and make a profit. Secondly, he also knows that the development of gas-fired power stations is a nonsense because they're 30% more expensive to operate than if we used British coal. And thirdly, we are importing coal into Britain with an adverse impact on our balance of payments, costing some £600 million more than it would do if we used British coal. And in every single case, coal that's being imported is being subsidised or produced by child labour in Colombia or produced by virtual slave labour in places like South Africa. Now, don't tell me it's not, because I know that it is, even in places like Australia, where they get 150% rebates on all their research and development costs. But when you total that up, it's over £2 billion that Britain's taxpayers could save if we depended upon clean coal technology, and we could have an environment fit to live in. And finally, let me say this. In addition to all that, for a minister that talks about competitiveness and a minister who talks about saving money, you should know that the closure of the 30 pits earmarked in the secret document I leaked would result in you having to pay £2.1 billion in closure costs that would be saved if you kept the pits open, producing valuable, cheap coal for Britain, certainly cheaper than nuclear or gas.
Thank you. Michael Portillo, do you dispute any of that? Do you dispute the numbers?
I dispute most of it. I mean, it's nothing to do with...
Well, how?
It's nothing to do with nuclear, because...
Which is the biggest part of it that you dispute?
Well, let me dispute a couple of bits. It's nothing to do with nuclear, it seems to me, because the nuclear component has not been growing in recent years. That's been pretty well constant.
Is it more expensive?
So what Arthur Scargill...
Is it more expensive?
Both the nuclear power industry and the coal industry have been heavily subsidised by the government. Now, what the problem is, from your point of view, Arthur, is that fuels are coming along now which are not subsidised by the government. Your real problem is that an electricity industry which is independent-minded, that doesn't just make assertions, as you've made, but actually is spending its money, is making the decision that it cannot afford to buy coal in the quantities that it used to buy it from the pits of this country. Now, that is a purely commercial decision, and it overrides your assertions that this is more expensive or that is more expensive. These people are trying to provide electricity at the minimum cost, and I might say also the minimum pollution, which is also something they need to bear in mind. And these coal stations, one of the things that makes them expensive is if you are going to clean out the sulphur and clean out the nitrogen oxide and so on, it makes it very much more expensive to do by comparison, for example, with gas. Now, what are we going to do? Are we going to say that British industry should bear a particular burden to subsidise the coal mining industry? Are we going to say that we should have a more polluted atmosphere in order to keep the coal industry going? I don't believe either of those propositions is realistic.
But what about the environmental impact of burning off all that gas in power stations? It may be cheap now. It may seem, let's take his argument as it stands. But in the long term, it's not the right argument for the environment, any more than bringing in that cheap Venezuelan coal, which is very, very bad indeed for the environment. You seem to be completely ignoring all of that, and yet your government claims to be one that supports the environment.
Margaret, they're all resources. Gas or coal, they're all resources. Once you burn them, you can't have them again. They're all the same in that respect. But at least gas does not produce the environmental problems of sulphur, for example, that coal does, and it is the choice of fuel of the industry, and that's what you can't dispute. Unless the Labour Party, a Labour government, is going to go back to saying that the government decides who burns what and the government is responsible for higher electricity prices, and where will the competitiveness of British industry be then?
But you're doing just that. If you're giving £1.3 billion to the nuclear industry and nothing to the coal industry,
nothing.
You are nothing.
13 billion.
You're not giving 13 billion at all. You're giving no help whatsoever, no subsidy at all to the British coal industry. If you don't believe me, look at your own evidence to the European Commissioner.
But he is the financial secretary.
I don't care what he is.
No, it's very worrying, actually.
Chief Secretary, beg your pardon.
Well, if he's Chief Secretary to the Treasury and he doesn't know that nuclear power receives a subsidy annually of 1.3 billion and the British coal industry doesn't receive any subsidy at all, he should do.
Let's hear some views from here. Is there still a Lancashire coalfield, or is that gone?
There's one pit, and his party and British Coal are threatening to close it.
Gentleman up there in the striped jersey.
When we close these 20, 30, 40 pits, do we lose that coal forever as a national asset? Or can we go later and get it out again?
Well, let's not get bogged down in that. I believe the technology could advance and you can reopen pits, but it would be very expensive to develop.
It would take you 10 years at least to have a lead-in time, if it was possible.
Yeah, and I've missed out our question, Mr. Purdy, who's sitting there wondering why I missed him out. It was an entire oversight.
Well, we are importing coal, and it makes me wonder how we can afford to do it when we already have a £30 billion deficit on the balance of payments. We haven't even enough industry now to pay for to make our own stuff for this country. We have to import. It's all going to go worse, and as long as we've got the stuff in the ground, why don't we get it? I'd love to see a balance sheet of the profit to industry of importing cheap coal and the loss to government of putting people on the scrap heap.
That lady there.
Yeah. It seems that once again, British industry is looking only to the short term, not to the long term as regards jobs and safeguarding our natural resources.
And the lady just behind you.
Mr. Portillo has said that British Coal are reducing their operations in line with market demand. Could he then tell us why British Coal are expanding their open cast workings and destroying the environment? We've got the environmental degradation that goes hand in hand with a 1,000-acre open cast mine site on the site of an old deep mine that has recently closed.
This is a local issue here, is it not?
This is a local issue, yes.
Yeah.
Well, and a national issue, as Arthur says.
Of course, because that coal mining near the surface is much more economic than deep mine coal. It creates economic damage in the short term. They restore the land at the end of the period. But it is the same reason. It is how, in the long term, is British industry ever going to compete if we don't allow ourselves to develop the cheapest resources at home and to burn the cheapest fuels in our power stations to keep down our electricity prices. Somebody said a moment ago we're looking to the short term. That's not so. That is looking to the long term, because our competing industries need to have access to electricity at least as cheap as the electricity in Germany and France and Holland and Belgium.
Right at the back there.
Yes, I'd just like to ask Mr. Portillo, with the rate that this government is decimating industry, which industry in particular has he in mind that he's actually going to buy power?
The car industry, the smelting industry, the engineering industries of the Midlands, they're all highly dependent on the electricity price. And over the years, by the way, these industries have complained bitterly that they are paying more for electricity in Britain than their competitors are paying in countries abroad. And it's time to address that issue.
Thank you. Gentleman here.
If Arthur Scargill doesn't believe that a pit is uneconomic, why don't the NUM simply buy it from British Coal?
Arthur.
There's a very simple answer. We already own it. It belongs to the British people. Why the hell should we buy a pit that we already own? And quite frankly, when Michael Portillo suggests that we want in Britain the same opportunity to compete as our, say, European neighbours is misleading this audience. In Germany, for example, the production costs of coal are £110 per tonne. In Britain, as a result of the exchange rate fiasco 2 weeks ago, the average price of coal is about £36 per tonne. Deep mine coal. It's the cheapest deep mine coal in the world. And quite frankly, if they would give to the British coal mining industry only a small proportion of the huge 1.3 billion subsidy they're giving to the nuclear power industry, Britain's coal industry could not only be maintained, it could expand and it could thrive, and we could export coal to Europe.
He wants to know whether you're going to become a coal owner when the industry is privatised.
And I've already explained to him that Britain's mines are owned by the British people, and therefore we have no intention of buying that which already belongs to us.
I'll just take one more from the gentleman at the back, as long as it's not a question to Michael Portillo.
I wanted to comment on the open cast mining thing. Mr. Portillo said that the effects were short-term. In fact, they're long-term. In East Lancashire, we've had long and many fights.
Can you be brief?
Right. We've also just had to fight against our emulsion, dirty foreign fuel coming in. He seems to value everything in terms of money. We've got to have a national strategy so we can build the environment into the national energy structure.
Thank you very much. I'm going to leave that there. I'm going to take another question from Maureen Hindle, who is an officer in charge of an elderly person's home. Maureen Hindle.
Good evening. Following the post-mortem on Labour's election defeat, it has emerged that failure to attract women voters was a major factor. How does Labour propose to remedy this in the next election, and can the panel explain why so many women vote Tory?
Can the panel explain why so many women vote Tory? In the last election, incidentally, of women over 35, 32% voted Labour and 48% Tory. Of women over 55, 31% voted Labour against 49% voting Tory. Margaret Beckett, you stood for the deputy leadership on the women's vote.
I stood for any vote that was available. I think this is a very worrying question for us because a lot of evidence, I know opinion polls are rather in disrepute at the moment, but if you don't pay too much attention to the numbers, but look at some of the factors that they identify. Many of the women who, when asked, talk about the main concerns to them being the issues that are of prime concern to the Labour Party and that indeed are issues with which the Labour Party is identified. And if within those areas, say health or education, people are asked what are the policies they want to see, by and large they identify the policies that the Labour Party was putting forward, and yet still they voted for the Conservative Party. And it is one of the most worrying questions that we have to address, and no one is entirely sure of the answer. There is partly a feeling that perhaps many of those women do see the Labour Party with too much of a male-dominated image. This is, I must say, not the way the Labour Party is today at all. But perhaps that is the perception that they still retain. And obviously we have to do a lot of work to overcome that. And having more women in prominent positions in the party is one of the ways that I think we can tackle it.
Michael Portillo, why do you think they go for the Tories?
I think they probably voted for us on economic issues. I think they voted for us on education. I think they were very impressed by our commitment to standards, by transferring the power in education down to the local school, grant-maintained schools and local management of schools. And I think Margaret is right. They probably rejected the male-dominated image of the Labour Party, which largely, I think, derives from the trade union bloc vote. And what I find rather interesting, being here in Blackpool this week, is that the Labour Party are behaving as though they won the election. They're having a celebration. It's certainly not a time, apparently, for analysis. They don't seem to want to ask themselves why they lost the election. They're avoiding that question altogether. And Margaret, you see, has just said, oh, well, yes, we ought to think about that. Well, probably they ought to think about it, and you'd think they'd spend their conference week thinking about it, but apparently they've entirely ignored the issue. And on the trade union bloc vote, which I think is a big part of it, they've taken this momentously courageous decision to reduce the power of the bloc vote at their conference from 87% to 70%. So the Transport and General Workers Union will in future only have 1 million votes instead of 1.25 million votes. Well, it seems to me they've probably got quite a long way to go before they start breaking down some of these images, which I think were repellent not only to women, but to voters in general.
Now, having heard just the Labour and the Tory view, let's hear our questioner now about what Maureen Hindle feels is wrong.
Well, I think that the women of this country were largely cheated by what the Tory party had to offer at the election, and I think they failed in the responsibilities of what they promised women. They did want security.
But we want to know why you think women voted for the Tories.
I think they voted because Mr. Major was a nice man. And I think they placed a lot of trust in Mr. Major, and I think that that trust has been broken because the promises have been broken. But I don't think that just goes for women, I think that goes for men as well.
Arthur Scargill.
I think the questioner's got a point. I think women, and indeed a large proportion of men, didn't vote for the Labour Party because they didn't trust it. They couldn't perceive a great deal of difference between the Tory party and the Labour Party's policy, and I say this with regret, Margaret. And the fact is that there was a perceived view that the Labour Party leader would go to any lengths and drop any principle or policy in order to get elected. And quite frankly, it had the opposite effect upon voters, in my view. I honestly believe that what we do need in this country is a complete change in the electoral system. It really is ridiculous, you know, that we have a government in power taking us into the ERM without a vote, doing things that they deem necessary or essential, when they've only received 41% of the votes of the British electorate in a poll. 59% of the total electorate are against them. And the sooner that Labour adopts one new policy, and that's proportional representation, the sooner that we'll begin to persuade Parliament to change the electoral system and get rid of the Tory government once and for all.
But the example you've chosen, the ERM, the other two parties, the other 51%, or 59%, they backed it as well. They all voted for the same thing.
I think I said in the first part of my response that voters could perceive little difference between the two major parties, and that was a fact. And in the final analysis, I think the questioner was right. It came down to their view that they thought Mr. Major was a pretty nice man. Certainly compared to a leader, and I say it regrettably, who appeared to be ditching every single policy and principle that we'd ever had. I mean, don't forget that Neil Kinnock, over many years, had strove vigorously in support of unilateral nuclear disarmament, argued vigorously in support of nationalisation, and gone on the offensive on a whole range of other issues.
So had Margaret Beckett.
Wait a minute. We're talking about what caused people, particularly women at the last election, to vote for the Tories. And I'm only giving you my view. There has to be some explanation. I think the questioner, in part, has hit it on the head. I think, quite frankly, in the main, it was because the electorate perceived very little difference between the two parties, but at the end of the day, they thought, maybe wrongly, but they thought that the Labour Party leadership were prepared to ditch most policies and principles simply in order to get elected. That's not how you win elections. You win them on the basis of policy and principle that's an alternative to their policy.
Malcolm Bruce.
I must say, I think my own view is that voters at the election basically didn't really like the Tories very much. They didn't trust Labour, and they didn't think the Liberal Democrats could win. And that left them with a considerable dilemma, and I think a lot of votes were cast at the last minute, very, very openly, and on a sort of gut feeling of the moment. And I think the questioner is right, and I think Michael Portillo is right, that at the time, the majority of women tended to feel that they trusted the Tories better than they trusted Labour to deliver economic success. I equally agree that their trust was very sadly misplaced, and they have been very much betrayed. I think it's also interesting to hear Arthur continuing in his robust role in attacking his own party, and it's perfectly true that people did say to me, the one thing I don't want is Neil Kinnock. After all, a man who's delivered and ditched every principle in order to try and win government can do it again. So that, I think, is one of the reasons why he wasn't trusted. And just a final twist, I hear that the CND has been virtually expunged from the Labour Party conference, but they're attending the Conservative Party conference for the first time this year. So it suggests to me that there's a pitch going on here that even we haven't anticipated.
Right, come on, ladies. That Lady at the back there.
I found Mr. Scargill has been very condescending to the women of this country. There's a lot of very intelligent women in this country who've studied the policy of all the parties and had the good sense to vote the Conservative government back in.
Thank you. That lady there.
I'd like to make a plea to Margaret Beckett. I think we've got to be very careful in the Labour Party, Margaret. We mustn't make the Women's Conference biannual. We must have it every year. And we must get it reported in the media. And we must have more women.
You can tell her this afterwards, you know. This is operational guidance, isn't it? That lady there. Yes.
Right. Well, now that we see that John Smith, I see it in today's Times, that John Smith has ditched his image makers. So maybe next time we'll get honest John instead of nice John.
And that lady next to you.
I appreciate what the lady said about women voting for John Major because he appeared to be a nice man. But most women have more sense than that, and we voted for the Conservatives because they offered us the policies we wanted and the Labour Party didn't. And it's as simple as that.
Margaret Beckett.
Well, I think that the Conservatives certainly said things that many people wanted to hear, but I'm sorry, I'm afraid that they lied to you. And I think one of the things Michael Portillo just said was very revealing. He said that people wanted to see more power to schools. That's what's happened. More power has gone to schools. It was supposed to go to parents, remember, Michael? A Freudian slip, perhaps, on your part. Oh, no, it's not. Oh, no, it is not.
It is
what is
for
happening
parents.
now under these grant-maintained schools is that schools are choosing parents, not parents choosing schools. Parents are being required to line up for interviews. This isn't supposed to happen, of course, but it is happening, and it's exactly what we all knew would happen.
Parents are
You
delighted
spent a great
with
deal
the
of money.
reforms. We're giving
You spent
power
a
to
great
those
deal of
people.
money.
You wanted to keep it with the local
giving
authorities.
people the impression that everything was going to be all right, that indeed they couldn't trust Labour and that they could trust you, and already I think they're seeing they're mistaken. And I'm sorry, I do have to be allowed to just say to Arthur, I know that he and Neil have had their strong differences, but I do think that it is outrageous. Neil was a very courageous, an immensely effective leader. He did what he thought was right and best in the interests of his country and his party, and he'd be a far better Prime Minister, and we would have been a far better government, and we wouldn't be in the shambles that we have today if we had been elected.
Peter. Malcolm Bruce, and then
Margaret, you've just confirmed what Michael said. You actually said that as if you had almost won the election when you lost. And I think there are very serious questions coming out, which I believe all political parties have got to face, that what is it the people of this country are looking for? They're not happy with the present government. They clearly don't think the alternative government is credible. I like to believe that we've got a contribution to make to this, but I think one of the things that women certainly say to me is that what they don't like about the Labour Party is its tendency to be collectivist, to be big brother, to tell them what they should be doing, rather than to help them make their own decisions. And that is something I think we have got to try and
We were the only party in
find
this
ways of
election who increased seats and who increased our vote. I know you lost seats and lost your share of the vote, and I can understand why you were sorry, but we do have quite a bit to celebrate, although not as much as we deserve.
You lost the election.
And very briefly.
Well, I thought there was great unfairness to Neil Kinnock there. The key policy that lost for Labour was the taxation policy. That was devised by Margaret Beckett and John Smith. Neil Kinnock wanted to get rid of it at that famous meal at Luigi's restaurant. John Smith stuck him with it, and that lost them the election in good part.
Right, we're going to take a fourth question from Sue Wood, who is a mature student. Sue.
Does the panel think that the Home Secretary's decision to refuse a pardon to Derek Bentley was the right one?
Malcolm Bruce.
I think it's a very difficult question to answer. I mean, I think the natural sort of human sympathy lies with the feeling there's a miscarriage of justice, the anguish of his family, and so on. What has never really been disputed, that he was involved in a crime which led to murder. And that in that sense he was properly convicted. That's not a pointed issue. The question, as I understand it, was he didn't pull the trigger, somebody else did, and because of the age factor, he was hanged and the other person was not. That inevitably leads to a very great sense of injustice. And I certainly don't think I would have liked to have done Kenneth Clarke's job today of saying, I don't believe the case should be reopened, but if I had been the Home Secretary, I would have issued a reprieve. I don't think that's going to be much comfort to his family. And that is personally one of the reasons why I am passionately opposed to capital punishment, because saying sorry after you've executed somebody is simply not good enough.
I make at this point my customary plea for brevity. Arthur Scargill.
The decision today was disgraceful. Derek Bentley was in custody at the time when the shot was fired, and anyone looking at this case objectively and fairly would come to the conclusion that he was not guilty. And I make no apology for this. I say, without fear of contradiction, that had he been put in prison for life, he would have been joining the Birmingham Six and the Guildford Four and others who were victims of miscarriages of justice. And I agree with what Malcolm Bruce has said. It's, thank God we've got rid of the death penalty, but quite frankly, this case cries out for justice. And the sooner that the Tory government come to a conclusion that Derek Bentley was innocent of the crime for which he was charged and is given a pardon, the better.
Michael Portillo.
Well, there clearly are two separate issues, and Kenneth Clarke has crawled over them very carefully. One is, should he have been convicted? And the other is, should he have been hanged once he had been convicted? Two men, both armed, went to commit a crime. And under the law of this country, even as it stands today, if two men go armed to a crime with the intention of resisting arrest, and the resistance of arrest leads to a murder, then even under the law today, both men are held to be responsible because they could foresee the consequences of going armed to that crime. Now, that is the principal reason in a very complex case why Kenneth Clarke believes that the conviction was fair. As far as the point of the death penalty is concerned, even in those days when we had the death penalty, there was a matter for the Home Secretary as to whether he should issue a reprieve. There clearly were special factors in the Bentley case, such as the man's mental age and so on. Now, who can put themselves in the position of a Home Secretary in 1953, not least considering how much society has changed since then? But all one can say is that, of course, it might have been possible to reach a different decision on the point about hanging the man, but Kenneth Clarke does believe that the jurors of the day were right. He has no reason to question their judgment about the conviction itself. Margaret Beckett.
I think this is immensely difficult, but I have to say I do think that the pardon should have been given. Michael Portillo said that someone who goes to a crime armed must foresee the consequences, but surely it's partly the point about Derek Bentley that he probably couldn't necessarily foresee the consequences. That and the fact that he was in custody, as Arthur says, that and the fact that he didn't actually pull the trigger, that and the fact that it's quite doubtful whether he actually uttered the words he was said to have uttered and on which basis he was convicted. I know that lawyers always have to worry so much about precedents, but the man is dead, so it's hardly likely that it could be used as a precedent in similar circumstances of this particular kind. And I must say that I do think, I looked at the press release that Kenneth Clarke issued, and it's full of lawyer-like tortuousness. I'm sorry he couldn't find a way to cut the knot.
But it's not a matter of emotion when you make a decision like that, is it, Margaret?
It's a matter of emotion for his family.
Of course it is, but the Home Secretary has to use his judgment about the law. I mean, the Home Secretary would have found it the easiest thing in the world, of course, to have pardoned Bentley. That would have been the easy course for him. If he has not done so, it must be that after a scrupulous consideration of the evidence, he believes that there's no reason to question the decision that the jurors took. After all, the jurors knew at the time they were dicing with a man's life, back in 1953.
But the jurors didn't know some of the things that we're saying now, that maybe he didn't say the words which led them to convict him.
And it didn't rest on that.
Ask our questioner, Sue Wood, what she thinks.
I think that it's a really difficult question, and the Home Secretary could only really base his decisions on the facts, not on the rights or wrongs of the capital punishment aspects of it.
Thank you very much. I'll take that gentleman there.
The non-decision makers in this case, and probably for the foreseeable future, always seem to be interested in the people that were guilty or tied in with crimes. In other cases like it, why aren't they worried about the people that have been victims of these crimes?
And a quick one from this gentleman here.
Might I suggest that the country, the government, and especially the media should concentrate on the crimes of today rather than concentrating on the crimes of the past? Haven't we enough crime out in the streets now to be worrying about rather than what's happened in the past?
Thank you very much. Well, that, unfortunately, is all we have time for tonight. Next week, Question Time comes from the Conservative Party conference in Brighton. And on the panel then will be the Environment Secretary Michael Howard, Labour's Shadow Chancellor Gordon Brown, Paddy Ashdown, the leader of the Liberal Democrats, and Sir Clifford Chetwood, chairman of the construction giant Wimpey. Now, before we go, if any of you would like to be part of the Question Time audience when we're in Maidstone on the 22nd of October, here's the number to phone, 071 284 4000. Maidstone, October the 22nd, 071 284 4000. We'll then send you a questionnaire from which, when you send them back, we can begin making up the representative sample of the British public for that Maidstone programme. So, until next Thursday at 10:50 on BBC1, thank you for watching, and to you all, a very good night.
Join a shimmering array of talented and witty personalities and me every Friday, 10:20 on BBC1. See you then.
And now drama to conclude our Thursday on BBC1, with colleagues closing ranks to defend a top medical man facing a murder charge, another case of law and order.